Thank you for coming to my virtual book talk. I am Christopher Lehman. I am the author of Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. I am also a professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University in the Ethnic, Gender, and Women's Studies Department. I have been there for 18 years, and as long as I've been in Minnesota, I have done work on Minnesota's African American history, and more specifically, St. Cloud's African American history. And it was in looking at St. Cloud's African American history that I started to find some of the information that would eventually go into Slavery's Reach. Now, before Slavery's Reach, I had written a book for a different publisher about slavery in the Midwestern states along the Mississippi River, slavery in the upper Mississippi Valley. And when I was working on that book, what I largely focused on was documents that could suggest that there were African Americans held as slaves in Minnesota. But that research was very hard and sometimes not terribly conclusive. But it was in reading articles by Ta-Nehisi Coates about reparations and about the monetary considerations of slavery and segregation that I started to think more in terms of more concrete proof. And when it comes to money, that's receipts and that's deeds. So what I started doing was going to Stearns County first, again, since I live in St. Cloud, and I would go to the recorder office where the real estate deeds were. And since Minnesota was a territory and a state during the years of legal slavery, what that meant was that even though for most of that time Minnesota was a free territory and a free state, it was still possible for people who came from slave states to come to Minnesota and do business. And real estate deeds were this very accessible kind of documentation to show if any kind of transactions had been made. So since Stearns County was formed in 1856, that was a good 9 years that I could look at between 1856 and 1865, when slavery ended, to see if I could find Southerners who bought land in St. Cloud. And I found quite a few people. So what I would do is write down the names of all the people who were listed as Southerners in those deeds. And then I would go home and I would go to a database like Ancestry.com or FamilySearch.org and look at the slave schedules, which would list names of slaveholders and list the slaves that they held anonymously. And if any of the people who were Southerners buying land were also slaveholders in these slave schedules, then I knew that that real estate deed that I found was the paper trail that documented money coming from a slave plantation into the hands of a Minnesotan. And so I did that for Stearns County and for neighboring counties and for counties along the Mississippi River for the most part, because that's most likely where Southerners would have traveled, the Mississippi River coming all the way from Louisiana and Mississippi. And I was able to find quite a few interesting things. Probably the thing that most amazed me to find is on page 90 of the book. It's about a man who came from Maryland just to be in Minnesota during the summers. So he was a snowbird. His name was Robert Dyson. And in May of 1858, there is a newspaper advertisement in his hometown newspaper in Maryland. And that announcement is that he has a brand new real estate office in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then right below that ad for his real estate office is an advertisement where he is saying that when he gets back into town in Maryland, he has a woman that he wants to sell. And when I found this in the newspaper in Maryland, I knew that I immediately had to get some kind of copy of it. I knew that I had to print it and I had to give it to my publisher to make sure that it would definitely be included in the book. I have never found anything like it since. I certainly didn't know anything about it before, but it is this documented proof that there were people who were living in Minnesota, even part time, who were still involved in the slave trade in the South. And then when I was looking at people who stayed in hotels, I would look for lists of people who had signed guest books because sometimes newspapers would say the names of people who came to a hotel in town and where those people had come from. And when it came to people coming to St. Cloud, what they would do in the newspaper is say the person's name and then say where that person is from. And then if that person brought any slaves with them, the slaves would not be listed by name, but instead listed as a servant or listed as a nurse. And on page 154, there is a duplicate of an advertisement, or not an advertisement, but a list of people who came to town and stayed at the Stearns house. And you'll find that quite a few people are listed as being from the South and having servants with them at that hotel. Now, to get a sense of what the book is about, I thought that I would read a little bit from the introduction. From the establishment of Minnesota as a territory in 1849 to the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, slaveholders invested in land and businesses in Minnesota. Many of them traveled from their southern homes to make the transactions in person, but others arranged for Minnesotans with power of attorney to facilitate the purchases. The investors' practices spanned the gamut of human possession, represented by yeomen who owned a single enslaved person, elite planters who kept hundreds of people captive, reluctant heirs who manumitted slaves whenever possible, and enthusiastic masters who acquired as many people as possible. It is not surprising that Southerners who were prosperous enough to invest or vacation in Minnesota relied on slaveholding wealth. This is not, however, the point. The recruiting of investors by Minnesota's political leaders, the eagerness of new communities to attract those investments, the participation of financial institutions, the catering to rich tourists, all were part of the web of connections tying Northern development to Southern slavery. Indeed, wealth pouring into Minnesota from the northeastern United States was also made in banking and industries that grew because of the labor of enslaved people. Minnesotans and other Northerners have forgotten their state's complicity in the slaveholding economy, just as some Southerners have denied that the Civil War was fought over slavery. A reader might question the relative level of slaveholder investment in Minnesota land and businesses. Did it comprise 1% or 10% or 40% of all investment in the state? While it is not possible to calculate this figure, it is abundantly clear that people in Minnesota invited, encouraged, and welcomed any investments and expenditures from slaveholders and broke their own laws in order to facilitate such income. Investments made by slaveholders were crucial to Minnesota's development at times and in specific areas of the state. This book does not argue that slaveholder wealth was the defining element in the growth of the new territory. Instead, it uncovers the ties and demonstrates how Minnesotans allowed illegal slaveholding in their communities and benefited from it. Minnesota was not a distant land far from the turmoil of 1850s US politics. It was the front lines of a pre-war battle over slavery. In tracing the people, financial institutions, and political entities that brought slaves and slaveholding wealth into the territory and state, this book demonstrates slavery's reach. So that's what the book is about. And it has been wonderful to have it be published and to get all sorts of feedback from people. One of the more common questions that I receive is, how did I find out about William Aiken and the loan that he made to the University of Minnesota? And that was purely by accident. I was not looking for that on purpose. What had happened was I was doing my research in Stearns County, and after I had found the name of a slaveholder from South Carolina named James Orr, I tried to find some newspaper articles about him and whether any of those articles would have mentioned him traveling to Minnesota. So one of the articles that I found about Orr in Minnesota mentioned that he had a traveling companion who served with him in Congress, and his name was William Aiken. And then when I pursued articles about William Aiken in Minnesota, that's when I found the articles that talked about the loan. And then I went to the U of M archives, the digital conservancy that they have, and they had paperwork that confirmed that Aiken indeed loaned this money. So that's how I found out about it. And it was certainly surprising because I'd always heard about the U of M starting in the 1860s after the Civil War, and therefore not necessarily having a connection to slavery. I didn't know that it had actually opened and closed a couple of times in the 1850s when slavery was still legal. And in my research, I found that Aiken's loan actually helped enable the U of M to reopen the first time in 1858, and that after it closed that same year, the state of Minnesota didn't want to let go of the money. And during the Civil War, the state of Minnesota passed a law that said that if anyone lived in a Confederate state, then that person could not come to Minnesota and sue. So even if Aiken wanted to get his money back, he could not. And he never did. So all of that was very exciting for me to find, at very least. And it is one of the more fun stories that I like to tell about. Well, not fun so much as quirky. It's a very quirky history because there's so much that's unexpected that you don't necessarily think of when you think about Minnesota. Another example, I think, is with the territorial secretary, or who we now call a lieutenant governor. But during the presidency of Franklin Pierce, he appointed the territorial secretary because Minnesota wasn't a state yet. And the person that Pierce appointed was a slaveholder from Virginia named Joseph Travis Rosser. And because Rosser was a Virginian and a slaveholder, that meant that someone who was one heartbeat away from being the governor of the territory was a slaveholder. And even though Minnesota was a free territory, someone who was definitely not invested in enforcing that law had the potential to be the chief enforcer of all of Minnesota's laws. And he seemed to be well liked in the 4 years that he was a territorial governor or territorial secretary. But once he's out of office, and especially once the Civil War happens, and Rosser, who's back in Virginia by then, joins the Confederacy, then Minnesotans turn on him completely. And one of the stories in the book that is quirky and actually funny is that there's a premature obituary that's written about Rosser during the war. And even though Rosser is actually not dead yet, the paper goes on and on as if they think he is. And it just talks about how disliked Rosser was and how much of a traitor he was for going to the Confederacy. So it was pretty vicious, actually. You don't necessarily expect that kind of viciousness in our sort of Minnesota nice culture. But that's in the book as well. Other things that are probably fairly quirky include the time that Minnesota almost became a slave state after it became a free state. So there had been this big tourism business in Minnesota, especially from Southerners coming from the South. The vacation in the North, where it's cooler in the summertime. And in 1860, Minnesota had a Republican governor named Alexander Ramsey. And many people in Minnesota were afraid that if Minnesota had a Republican governor, then slaveholders would not want to come to Minnesota anymore because they feared that a Republican governor would want to take the slaves away. So there were quite a few people who were in the Minnesota legislature who proposed having slavery become legal in Minnesota just for the summer months. There was a bill that was introduced in the Minnesota House and a bill introduced in the Minnesota Senate. Now, fortunately, both of those bills failed, but they did not fail unanimously. And some of the people that I mentioned in the book as doing business with slaveholders were some of the people who voted for those bills. So I did not expect to find that. I did not expect to find evidence of Minnesota actively trying to legalize slavery despite it being a free state. And so whenever I hear from people who ask, well, what about the Civil War? What about Minnesota being one of the first states to fight for the Union? Usually, when I get those questions, it's couched in this language of a myth that when Minnesotans entered the war, it was to free the slaves. And that's just not true, because in 1861, there were still quite a few slave states that fought for the Union. Um, Again, slavery money from slaveholders, was still very important to Minnesota. I mean, that Rebellion Act that allowed Minnesota to keep the money for the U of M, that was in 1862. So even though Minnesota didn't want Confederates coming to get their money back, Minnesotans still wanted that money. So getting rid of slavery was not the motivating factor for Minnesota joining the war, like, at all. Now, you might have had maybe a couple of people who felt like John Brown here and there, but that does not represent the state of Minnesota in its entirety. But I love having written this book that is one of my biggest professional accomplishments. I'm very proud of the book. I'm very proud of the relationships that I've developed with the Minnesota Historical Society Press in order to make it happen. And I'm gratified that people like the book. I'm gratified that some people are assigning it for their own history classes. And I'm, of course, very humbled and honored that it won a Minnesota Book Award as well. And it was just a very happy day. The way that I had found out about it was that since it was a virtual ceremony, those of us who were finalists were told that we would have to have our phones nearby. And if we won, then the producer would call us at the time that the host introduced the category, so that by the time the host announced the winner's name, the winner would already be on the phone. So I had my phone with me up here in this room, actually, and it was maybe a few seconds before the host announced the category that I saw my phone buzz, and I just let out this gasp because I knew at that point that I had won. It was a very exciting event. Um, and it's just the icing on the cake, because this has already been a great 7 months now that the book has been out. And I hope that all of you enjoy reading it as well. I hope that if you have any questions about it, if you have any thoughts about it, any comments, especially if it challenges what you typically think of in terms of Minnesota, I'm more than happy to talk that out, or to have email conversations and to sort everything out, because it is a lot to process. It's not easy to have your frame of reference adjusted. It's not easy to believe something for years, maybe even for generations, and then be told that there's more to the story, or that what you thought was a little wrong, or maybe completely wrong. I mean, if you look at the issue of Minnesota and its legal status, for example, I think most people are taught about Minnesota being a free territory and them being a free state. And what they don't necessarily know about is a 14-month period when slavery was actually legal. I think most Minnesotans are taught about Dred Scott being a slave held in Minnesota, and they're taught about him being the Dred Scott of the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court. But what gets left out is what the meaning of that case was, which was that the Supreme Court's verdict in March of 1857 said that anywhere that a slaveholder wanted to take a slave, he or she could, and have that slave remain a slave. And at the time, Minnesota was still a territory, it was not a state yet. So, since Minnesota would not be a state until May of 1858, that meant that there was a whole 14 months where slavery was legally possible in Minnesota. And while there was not an influx of Southerners wanting to establish plantation slavery, because the soil won't cooperate, and it's too cold most of the time, there was an influx of Southerners wanting to come to Minnesota to do business and to bring their slaves with them while they were in Minnesota to do business and not worry about somebody taking their slaves. And during that 14-month period, that was when they could with the most confidence. And so there is an uptick in the numbers of people who invest in real estate throughout Minnesota. And it was a pretty big deal depending on where you lived. Like here in St. Cloud, for example, the northernmost part of St. Cloud, where the hospital is, that land is land that was invested by Southern slaveholders. Practically the entire towns of Belle Plaine and Shakopee had investments from slaveholders from Southern states as well. There are specific neighborhoods like the Payne-Phelan neighborhood in St. Paul. There's, of course, the U of M with William Aiken. And what I've been telling people ever since the book came out, when it comes to Minnesota existing during the years of legal slavery, is that with slavery being as big of an institution as it is, or as it was in the United States, you can't live in a country with an institution that big and not be affected by it. So we know that Minnesota was. And what I tried to do in Slavery's Reach is just to show how. So I believe that's all that I have, and I am ready to take your questions and your comments. Thank you again for listening and watching.